Oh, right then. All right, so just give me your name and how to spell it. That way I don't look like an idiot and spell your name wrong.
David Simonowitz, Simonowitz.
Okay, and then go ahead and give me kind of what you do here at Pepperdine.
Okay. I'm the visiting assistant professor of Middle East Studies here at Pepperdine University, and I teach in the International Studies and Languages Division. Currently, I'm teaching second semester Arabic language, teaching visual culture of the modern Middle East, and I'm also teaching history of the modern Middle East.
Oh, very interesting. All right, so first question. This people's uprising that's happening in the Middle East right now, have we ever seen anything like this before?
Well, it depends how far back you want to go, but yes, we have seen such phenomena. Keep in mind, everyone is looking now at this sort of wave of uprisings that really took off in Tunisia and then had its most powerful, if you will, manifestation in Egypt. But, with the various attempts to analyze what's going on in the media, many people are describing this as a Facebook revolution or a Twitter revolution. That's not the whole story. And nonetheless, though, there was a sort of a precursor to this. We saw in 2009, in the summer of 2009, there were the events in Iran in which there was a considerable amount of unrest and an attempt at an uprising with regard to the results of the elections there that summer. And subsequently, we've seen some people argue this is sort of continuation of that wave of uprisings. Obviously, the one in Iran was not successful, but this is not the first time that such uprisings have taken place. Even in Egypt, for example, where you see the most obviously, how should I say, the transformation that has kind of occupied the media the most. This was not the first kind of uprising that we've seen in Egypt. Back in 1919, for example, there was an important uprising, sort of a precursor to a revolution. And this was at the time when Egypt was under British occupation, and along with the monarchy, the Egyptian monarchy, but you also had an important British presence in the country. And there were numerous general strikes in Egypt in 1919, and a host of other similar phenomena, including demonstrations and riots and so forth. But then shortly after 1952, when Naguib and Nasser, who were with the Free Officers Revolt, when they overthrow the monarchy and bring the Egyptian monarchy to an end, shortly thereafter you have another series of popular demonstrations and uprisings in which the populace attempts to set out a series of claims for democratic institutions, or at least attempts at some kind of more equitable representation. We don't hear too much about that, but that was not so effective either. The regime that came to power as of 1952 led to eventually the rule of Nasser, and then subsequently Anwar Sadat afterwards, and finally Hosni Mubarak for the past 30 years. But so this was not the first time that a popular uprising had taken place, an attempt at a revolt or a rebellion of sorts. But we've certainly seen examples of this in Egypt before.
Okay. And then now moving on to Libya, because it's kind of up in the air right now over there. Where do you see all of this headed for Libya right now?
Well, it's I'm not in the business of making guesses on that account, of prognostications and so forth, but it looks like things have changed very, very quickly and very dramatically. What appeared to be a very successful rebellion at first, or revolt, has now taken a different course. Gaddafi has a different attitude towards these uprisings than Mubarak did, or at least he has more absolute authority to engage the military forces of his country against the populace than Mubarak could have possibly had. And of course, they're two very, very different kinds of states. Currently, I believe it's one of the former interior minister who left the Gaddafi regime. I believe it's Abdel Fattah Yunus, who left the Gaddafi regime and joined as one of the commanders of the rebel forces. Unfortunately, the forces of the rebels are very disorganized, and they're not trained, and as everyone's pretty much aware, we're painfully aware from the media reports that we're getting, that it's turning into a very bloody situation. But there are some military officers and politicians who are engaged with the rebels in that regard. But it seems that at present, Gaddafi's forces are gradually retaking some of the territory that the rebels had held, and they're moving eastwards. The rebels, of course, hold Benghazi, which is one of the principal cities, and they're worried now that perhaps Gaddafi's forces will go around Benghazi and go straight to Tobruk, one of the big cities near the Egyptian border. And there's been a lot of talk, of course, about various mercenary forces that Gaddafi may be bringing in, some from countries such as Mali. Keep in mind that Gaddafi, of course, Libya is part of the Arab world in North Africa, but he's also has a particular position within Greater Africa and African Union and so forth, and he's capitalized on that position symbolically in some instances and practically in others. It's pretty remarkable, I think, that he's actually going out and hiring mercenaries. I think, if anything, that's probably one of the most, if you will, controversial maneuvers that he's engaged in, to say the least. Employing a mercenary force against your own population. But who knows? Those who are pro-Gaddafi over there may have a different perspective on it. Unfortunately, I can't speak to the percentages, who's pro-Gaddafi and who's anti-Gaddafi, but it seems to be a pretty substantial percentage of the population that's opposed to him. And again, I'm not on the ground, but the reports that I'm hearing and that I'm reading seem to indicate that there has been quite a bit of popular support for the rebellion. Some sources are saying that many of the people supporting Gaddafi are actually members of the security forces and the Secret Service, or their relatives, their extended networks. I imagine that's probably a little bit of an oversimplification, but it seems to be that considering how rapidly and how quickly some of the rebels took various cities from Tobruk and Benghazi to Masrata and Ras, various other cities over in the central area, there must have been a substantial amount of support. But right now, it's hard to tell where it's going.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier how Mubarak and Gaddafi are kind of taking different stances on their respective revolutions. And Mubarak stepped down to kind of help Egypt along in its protests while Gaddafi's fighting and slowly taking back the country. Do you think Gaddafi's going to stay in power, or are they somehow going to, the rebels are somehow going to muster enough to get him out of there?
Well, first, before I attempt to tackle that question, I mean, we also have to keep in mind that the nature of the state in Egypt was very different than in Libya. Mubarak had to answer to different interests in the government in Egypt. His was not an absolute power, although of course he had consolidated a tremendous amount of authority and power in his position. He didn't. It was not as if he were unanswerable to anyone, and that is comparably the case in Gaddafi's situation. I mean, there was no one who apparently had risen enough to question his authority, and you didn't have parallel institutions and authorities that could exert pressure on him. The military in Egypt was a much more powerful institution than Gaddafi's, represented a much bigger, how shall we say, percentage of even industry. I mean, they were involved in many aspects of government in Egypt. And again, we could see Mubarak in the line of leaders like Nasser and Sadat, carrying on, military officers who come to power. Differences, very tangible differences between the regime of, say, Nasser and Sadat, certainly in terms of their economic policy and so forth. But whereas Gaddafi really seems that he managed to create a sort of state culture and cult around himself almost. I don't know to what extent the populace abided by that cult or believes in it, but and it's easy for us to be critical now that his regime is somewhat on the defensive, but he was a very, very different individual than Mubarak. For whatever one's opinion of Mubarak, he did not set out to create a new ideology or a new political philosophy or a fusion of religion and politics, which Gaddafi clearly did in his so-called Little Green Book. If you think of Mao as having the Little Red Book, Gaddafi had the Little Green Book, in which he laid out a number of ideas, his Third Universal Theory and other ideas like that. And the kind of state that he proposed and promoted was something of a compromise between Islam and socialism. How he managed to reconcile those is, quite interesting. And so in that regard, Gaddafi had a much broader agenda then. But he'd been in power roughly since 1969, Mubarak since 81. But very, very different circumstances. Mubarak did not initiate a coup. I mean, his was a question of, he was there, he was seated there with Sadat in the formal state occasions and so forth. Gaddafi, of course, was instrumental. He staged a major transformation, essentially a coup, an overthrow of the previous regime. So the whole foundation, the premises of the state are very, very different than in Egypt.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so right now, France is recognizing the Libyan opposition as like the only representation of the country, and then Secretary of State Clinton is in talks with the opposition. How is this helping them right now, especially now that?
Well, certainly international recognition is going to grant a greater degree of legitimacy to the rebels. However, there's only so much that either the United States or France can do without committing itself to a major, potentially risky engagement. Some would argue that it's well worth that engagement. Others question what that entails. As you know, we are already stretched rather thin in terms of our overseas operations, not to mention just Afghanistan and Iraq, but other things that in which we're involved. I don't know that should necessarily be the only deciding factor, but what I'm really more concerned about at this point is, which I think is interesting, is that the Arab League, voted almost unanimously, with the exception of Libya, for a no-fly zone. The question now becomes, who can enforce that? Ultimately, they don't appear to be in any position to do so. Many of these Arab states do have air forces. Are they willing and ready? Are they capable of putting that into action? I think the burden of that kind of operation would fall to NATO, to Europe and the United States, and that's quite a commitment. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't or necessarily should. I'm not saying that it's should not be done, but there are many risks involved in that. And but I think it's important that France and the United States have come out in favor of the rebels. This is with all of the hesitation that's come with the official American response to these various transformations and changes and uprisings in the Middle East. This appears to be one of the most popular ones, and but even in the most popular of how shall we say, official positions, there are more than there are many opportunities to fall into some big problems. Time and again, we've attempted to engage ourselves in the Middle East in situations that appear to be popular or pretty generally supported, only to find ourselves embroiled in much more complicated situations. As I'm sure you've probably heard, some of the U.S. officials have stated that any kind of exercise or enforcing any no-fly zone is going to entail actually an attack on the Libyan forces before even such a situation can be enforced. It's not just a question of preventing planes from taking off or bombing and so forth. I mean, you have to put some muscle into it. So, if I understand correctly, we'd probably have to attack Libyan forces while they're on the ground before they can even take off. So, I mean, that's a bellicose action, and with it, we have to deal with a lot of questions regarding diplomacy and international law and so forth, and ethics and whatnot. And I'm not in a position to advocate it at this point or to condemn it, but it's certainly a dilemma that we have to face. I hope that further bloodshed can be avoided. It doesn't look like it's going to happen, though, and so we're faced with a moral dilemma. Do we let Gaddafi continue his campaign against the populations in the eastern part of the country? If they are legitimate, I mean, if these people are the legitimate representatives of the people of Libya, are we to stand by and let them be slaughtered and massacred by someone who now seems to enjoy no international support? Well, I shouldn't say no. I mean, actually, as a matter of fact, of course, Russia and China are opposed to enforcing a no-fly zone for various reasons. One of the Chinese ambassadors specifically stated that on a tour of Egypt and Tunisia and other places, that China does not want to see any kind of foreign intervention of that kind, that they believe it's necessary for the peoples of the Middle East to solve this themselves. But that could, if everyone stays out of this, we could eventually be saddled with the burden of at least in the public perception, especially in the Middle East and the Arab world, of having allowed a massacre to take place. So, it is a complicated situation.
Yeah, and then also this unrest in Libya is kind of affecting the U.S. economically. We have the rise in oil prices, the gas prices keep going up, the stock market is just kind of all over the place right now. Do you think if this kind of thing continues here, that the U.S. will probably send a military presence to Libya to try to get Gaddafi out and kind of quelch the situation?
Well, let me be a little bit optimistic in this regard, or rather, let me say that I hope that if
I'll just ask it a different way, I guess.
don't know if that red light was on before. Was that on before? I just noticed you have a red light.
Yeah, it was recording before. It's recorded like the last 20 minutes or so. So we got a good chunk of the interview.
Okay.
But just to rephrase this a different way, instead of being motivated by the rising oil prices or whatever, do you think we'll send troops to stop a massacre from happening in Libya?
Well, that depends on how long.
Is that a better motivation than oil?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think it depends on how long this situation plays out. As I said, I certainly hope that we do not go in there solely out of concern for oil prices. I think we have to measure the human costs and the moral and ethical considerations before the oil prices. And I know that may sound a bit naive, but I also think that we have to practice what we preach and support self-determination and popular movements for when people's attempt to determine their future so I think that really should be our motivation. Inevitably, we can't satisfy everyone. Not everyone is going to support the United States, regardless of whether we decide to get involved on the ground or in the air with U.S. military forces, or if we remain outside the field of conflict. But again, I certainly hope that we do not do so based on questions of oil prices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And then what will be the impact, we'll say, in the region for now, if Gaddafi manages to stay in power? What's going to happen?
That's a very good question. I mean, I can only speculate because he'll inevitably be viewed as something of a pariah. That the Arab League approved a no-fly zone should send him quite a message. Of course, it's easy to pass a resolution for no-fly zone. It's another thing to enforce it, again, as we said earlier. And a lot of these gestures, well, some of them are more than symbolic. And I think that will really put him in a vulnerable position, assuming that he manages to defeat the uprising, defeat the rebels. I'm not necessarily assuming that, but if he does, he will still be in a precarious position. Mm-hmm. I think that this will really be the foundation for a long-term resistance to him. Will certainly has been sown, one way or another. And it's rather ironic that this is taking place now, because Gaddafi had been seen as something had been one of the archetypal prize for the United States, especially in the 80s, the 90s. If you recall, we bombed Libya in the 80s under the Reagan administration. We bombed Tripoli, and this was in response to the broadly held perception, fact that Gaddafi was engaged in promoting international acts of terrorism, bombings in European discos and bars and things like that, of course. And then subsequently, of course, later on there was the bombing of the Pan Am flight, which crashed over Lockerbie, Scotland, which was a terrible tragedy, a crime for that matter. What is curious is that in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion of 2003, Gaddafi started coming around again towards rehabilitating his image on an international level. That he had begun to publicly move away from supporting the kinds of radical positions that he had promoted and advocated, and it appeared that he was moving towards reconciling his government and his policies in general, at least superficially, with the West. And now, ironically, it's when these uprisings take place. But this is what happens when you have these authoritarian regimes with rulers in place for multiple decades, without popular sanction, without legitimate sanction. Eventually, the populations are just they're chafing, and it's an explosion waiting to take place. And now it may not, it's hard to know how that's going to play out, but he sort of reaped what he had sown just substantially later.
Yeah. And then just last question, is there any other point you'd like to make concerning this entire situation that's going on right now?
Well, we're in the thick of all of this. We're in the midst of a historically important period of transformation, and we're still in the forest. We can't see the forest for the trees. It's everything is transpiring so quickly, but I don't believe that this is only the result of this new era of technology, of Facebook and Twitter and internet. That certainly adds a new dimension to it and certainly facilitates some of this. But these movements, and this may sound like something of a platitude, but a lot of the a lot of the unrest that has been brewing was not. It didn't come about in a vacuum. These technologies didn't create these problems or these situations. I think it's really only acted as an accelerant to something that would have taken place anyway, inevitably, eventually.
All right. It's all
Okay.
very interesting.
Okay.
This probably would have led our show yesterday had there not been that earthquake and tsunami in
Oh.
Japan.
So did you do a show yesterday?
No, we have a show just Tuesday and Thursday.